The Flyover Libertarian, Episode 2.
Hey, what's up? This is the Flyover Libertarian podcast, where two unimportant people from an unimportant place give you the opinion that you didn't ask for. I'm Josh, aka IOANCAP.
And I'm the Rural Rothbard. Today we're going to talk about Iran and war in general.
How about you run us down on what your opinion and observation is of the Iran situation?
Yeah, so brief history of the situation. The U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003 and propped up a Shia Muslim government, which is actually in line with Iran's Shia government. And then we occupied their country. That's the way I see it. What's the justification, Ben, for the U.S. and Iraq? Just continue to fight ISIS?
Yeah, I mean, mission accomplished, but obviously we went in for the usual reasons we give, to support peace and democracy in the Middle East. I remember when it first happened, I was way on board with Iraq, and so I was trumpeting every lie that came out of W's mouth. In fact, if you're ever wondering why I have such a ire toward George W. Bush, it's because he took me in. Like, he just took me for a ride. Ultimately, it was about, all the things that you'll often hear. It was about oil, but really more than anything, it was about, the word you hear used is hegemony, the American empire in the Middle East. Like, every nation out there is ruled by dictators. It's almost all of them are ruled by dictators. They only become a problem when that dictator decides they don't want to use the dollar for trading oil anymore, or they don't want the U.S. doing business in their country. Like, that's when suddenly we decide they're in need of, suddenly this murderous tyrant needs to go because we care about the people. But it always happens to dovetail with American interests, and no one talks about that. Like, that's why I shared a tweet on the page the other day, was talking about going into war in Iran, and I said, and all the bankers clapped. Because Murray Rothbard wrote a book, which is a phenomenally short, simple, concise book. Like, it's honestly, you hear about, a lot of times we talk about Murray Rothbard, and he's usually a great thinker and a great writer. But in this book, he just lists names. So the book was called Wall Street, Banks, and American Foreign Policy. And yeah, like I said, he just names names. He just goes through various war cabinets, and he points out their connection to big banks. And really, that alone is enough to make you be like, wait a minute, what's happening here? Like, why do the bankers always get a place in the Defense Department? It doesn't make sense. Bankers shouldn't care about, like, that shouldn't be their job, right? They should be in finance. Like, bankers should be in finance. That makes at least a sort of sense. I mean, I still think there's a conflict of interest problem, but why do bankers always have such an interest in foreign policy? And he basically comes to the position that it's because bankers are almost always statists. They look like they're a capitalist institution, and often that's who the left brands as the capitalist. But frankly, bankers are always involved in the machinations of the state, and especially the machinations of foreign policy. And how many times we've gone to war for the interests of bankers is going to astound you. And so, yeah, it's a really short book, really simple. And if you get the one from the free PDF from Mises Institute, you also get a foreword from a recently departed anti-war hero named Justin Raimondo. And he kind of brings the whole narrative up to date with the Iraq war, which I found really fascinating.
Yeah, that sounds good.
The amount of banker interest in that.
Well, we'll have to put that in the show notes page. How about that?
Yeah, I'd love to do that.
Wow, I feel like a real podcast now.
That's right. We're a real boy.
So basically, we propped up a Iraqi government that was in line with the Shia in Iran, and then we became surprised when that Shia government aligned itself with Iran.
Yeah, it's this crazy situation where, and and this is why maybe you've seen some libertarian takes of like, suddenly we're worried about Iran's influence in the Middle East, when by toppling Saddam Hussein, we gave them more interest in Iraq.
Yeah.
Or we gave them more influence in Iraq, because that's the thing is like, we in the West tend to think of Muslims as unified, when the reality is there are not just as many, but plenty of what we might call denominations, as in American Christianity. There's a lot of divisions and disagreements and serious disagreements. And honestly, this is what kind of became clear in the aftermath of Iraq is, sure, Saddam was not a great guy. He was a brutal dictator, but it turns out a brutal dictator is what that country needed to hold it together. Like, even from what I understand, even the very boundary lines of Iraq were imposed on it from outside by Europeans. And it's not naturally one country. There are different parts. We talk about the Kurds a lot. Well, it's this fascinating thing with the Kurds where they're actually a nation in two different nations. They're separated by a border. And this is part of the whole European forced vision of what Middle East would be. And Iraq is this combination of these multiple people groups and Islamic perspectives that apparently there needed to be a dictator to hold it together, because they weren't and I know this might sound surprising coming from a libertarian. The
point is, it's not our job to go in there and decide which minority group should be in power.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not our job. Certainly, that's a one aspect, but also like they weren't ready for liberty. Like that's something that you'll hear sometimes, especially nowadays. Like libertarians have started really discussing this issue of it might very well be that a given nation or culture is not actually ready for liberty.
You try to go in there and force it's not real liberty. If you try to go in there and take over their government and here you have democracy, congratulations. It's not real liberty when you do that. Yeah.
Like that's who was waiting in the wings to take power in Iraq. And then of course info has come out since then, finding out that, what did we call ISIS before they started calling themselves ISIS? We called them moderate rebels in Syria.
Yeah.
Like whenever you hear we're backing moderate rebels, you can be sure they're anything but that.
Yeah. We had to back the moderate rebels in Syria in order to take Iran down a notch in the area, in the region, right?
And as a result, ISIS started beheading Christians because, as it turns out, those, quote, murderous dictators were the best friends that the minority Christians had. Yeah. Because these guys were... What made them brutal dictators is that they were secular. Saddam Hussein had a shaved chin, Scott Horton always likes to point out. Scott Horton, by the way, is one of the greatest voices on anti-war in the libertarian movement. And if you want more information on anti-war things, you should definitely listen to his podcast and follow his Twitter. Or go to... I actually go to antiwar.com whenever I need information. He's one of the editors over there. But he always says, Saddam Hussein has a shaved chin. So does Bashar al-Assad, right? He's got a shaved chin. That's not a Muslim thing. That's a secular thing. Like, these guys are secular leaders. And as a result, they have no interest in keeping a Muslim hegemony. They're not going to support Muslim power in those countries and will actually protect Christians. what's really fascinating about this whole thing is that, you know, when, I'll be honest, when you had actually suggested, let's talk about Iran tomorrow, I was kind of like, I don't really know enough about this particular war yet. Like, my podcasting interests have been outside of war lately, so I haven't actually been listening to Scott Horton recently, so I don't know as much about this situation. I just know on principle, we're against war, and we're especially against interventionist war. And
that's confused a lot of people on the page.
Yeah, that's confused.
One day we're a Trump supporter, then one day we're a Democrat, and then these people comment on our page like they're just confused.
We've gone from Trump toady to Democrat in 3 tweets. It's ridiculous. But you know what? And this is part of what confuses people about libertarianism. For a lot of issues, we sound like run-of-the-mill right-wing conservatives. And I would say, especially because of my own leanings and my own background, I come from the right. I still largely identify culturally with the right. Yeah,
you're a cultural conservative.
I would call myself a conservative libertarian ANCAP. Like I have conservative moral and traditional values. And so largely my sympathies are on the right. And so when we break ranks like this, it really does confuse people. But we're really just being consistent with our libertarianism. Yeah, do you have more to say on that?
No, I'd say when you get accused of being a left-wing page and a Trump supporting page in the same week, it probably means you're doing something right based on principle. And I want people to dig into that and be like, well, why do you think that way? And I'm willing to be challenged in the comments and have actual discussions instead of just get called a left-wing page by some guy with a boomer name.
Yeah, well, what's hilarious is that, you know, while we're interacting with and reading comments, like I honestly just got tired a little bit and stopped paying attention. But like on one post, I'm having to argue that I'm not a Democrat. And on literally a post that's going on at the exact same time, I am also arguing with someone being like, I'm not a Trump toady. And so what's crazy is if you would just look around at our page, you would see that obviously your assumption about us isn't correct. But I will also acknowledge that part of the reason we've gotten a lot of comments is because we got a lot of shares and page reach from these memes. So in many ways, because we struck a chord with most of our audience that these memes got shared wide, and so we got a lot of comments from people who probably don't know what we're about. And so maybe now's a good chance to maybe talk about where do we place. Well, I guess why would libertarianism be anti-war necessarily? Is that something that people are confused by? And where does libertarianism fit on the left-right spectrum? And so, yeah, maybe that's what we can talk about now.
Yeah, I love the spectrum question, actually, because have you seen the chart with 2 axes? Left to right is conservative, liberal, left-wing, right-wing, and up and down is the authoritarian, libertarian.
Yeah,
I like that chart. How do you feel about that?
I like it to an extent. I like it to an extent. It does deal with, but that chart kind of assumes that right versus left is entirely on economic grounds.
Oh, sure.
Which I don't think is exactly true.
It's become a lot less true lately.
Well, I think actually, and I think this is actually, we're getting more toward the way the situation has always been. We need to make a 3D chart, really, because right versus left are really cultural, largely cultural. Like, right-wing conservatives in some country might be the pro-monarchists. In other country, like in America, the right-wing conservative is the pro-republic, because really what it means is conservative. What it really means is, well, it's right there in the word conserve. It's about conserving the traditional values of a society, which is going to be different in each society. Because a lot of it depends on, does this society have, I mean, I'll use some more stark terms, does the society need to be reformed? Like, that's a question needs to be asked. And I would say that would be a conservative tendency would be to say, no, no, we should not change this culture. Whereas a far left wing would be say, we need to change things. We need to change this culture drastically. And that's why the left wing is often called the radical wing or even the progressive wing, is because the idea that we need to move away from what the culture is. And so, the reason why the right wing in America tends to be pro-liberty, pro-economic freedom, things like that, is because
historically it has been that way.
The culture of America, yes, is born out of those values, out of what would be called the classical liberal values of
and that's why liberty, you can't go into Iraq, a country that hasn't had tradition of liberty, and assign them liberty and expect it to work. It's how you just get allied with Iran.
Right, exactly. And so it might well be that in libertarianism, this kind of jumping forward a little bit, libertarianism is hard to place on the spectrum because sometimes we're conservative and sometimes we're radical. Sometimes we're conservative, like sometimes, especially we of the Rothbardian, Hoppian school, like associated with the Mises Institute, acknowledge that conservative social values are the best way to create a stable society in which liberty can flourish. So a stable society like, especially a family-based society, that's one in which we don't need a welfare state. The need for a welfare state goes away when families take care of each other, and the welfare state undermines the family. And so there's a sort of a vicious cycle that the welfare state comes in because of the weakened society. It further weakens the family, which continues to drive people into the arms of daddy government because they don't have a real daddy to depend on. And so sometimes we're radical, sometimes we're conservative, but sometimes we're radical because we see that, like our goal is radical. We need to go a long ways. We need to radically change the way we think about government in this country. And it is a very radical perspective. My philosophy is based on Treebeard from Lord of the Rings. If it's worth doing slowly. But war is a fast change. And that's what we saw in the Middle East, is that our intervention is causing fast change. And Iraq wasn't ready for liberty in the way that it came. We took away their dictator before their culture was ready to step up to liberty. Really, it should have been, we educate the populace first, probably through trade interactions. You're doing business in the Middle East with private companies, not government corporate crony. But doing private business in the Middle East would help them see a culture of liberty and engage in the ideas of liberty. And through education, they would come to a place maybe of developing a culture that is friendly to liberty. But this was too fast, too quickly. And because we were not strategically conservative, we sent the region into chaos. A great example is Libya, who were an anarchist country for a little while because we sodomized to death Muammar Gaddafi. I think that's the right name.
Yep.
Because we literally sodomized him to death in the streets. They were in an anarchist state, which we as libertarian anarcho-capitalists would say, great, except that the result was human slavery, boldly in the streets, cultural chaos, because their society wasn't ready. And too much change too quickly causes chaos, which inevitably leads to just another dictator coming in and taking over. His great historical example would be the French Revolution, where without a culture ready for liberty, they abolished their kings, and then there was blood in the streets and heads rolling from the guillotine. And then what happened out of that chaos, they went for the first dictator to give them a chance at unity and power, and they got Napoleon. So that's a little bit of that.
So it seems like, from their point of view, come on, Josh. It's like they attacked U.S. troops over there. How dare you be against retaliation? How dare you?
Well, first of all, and I guess this gets to the last bit, I would say on principle, first of all, like as a more strategically conservative guy, as I said, and also because what is libertarianism at essence? It is a belief in private property, self-ownership, and the non-aggression principle. That's what libertarianism is. We're not just people who want to be left alone to do whatever we want. We're not just uber patriots. We are people who believe that a person has a right to their own body and property, and no one has the right to aggress that. And war is aggression on a large scale. Who gets hurt in war? Largely, it's the people who just signed up to protect their country. The people in the Iran army, the Iraq army, they signed up for the same exact reason your cousin joined the Marines. They wanted maybe a paycheck, maybe the benefits, or ultimately, maybe they really did just want to defend their country. And you think if our government is telling us that the Iran is this murderous, horrible regime, what do you think they're hearing?
And what are they seeing when they have drone strikes coming out of the sky hitting civilians?
Even more, like think about the terror of being from an Iranian perspective, an Iranian goat herder who just sees this American drone flying over their heads. And they have no idea if that thing is going to bring their death. And
literally with American military bases around their entire country.
Exactly. It feels like an enemy occupation. And this is where that meme with Iran having a bunch of bases around the United States comes in. Like, I can't believe I had to say this. We don't actually think Iran has bases all over the United States. Like, that's goofy. Someone actually said, imagine thinking Iran had this much money. No, this is an argument. If that were the case, what would we think? Especially thinking of our culture of liberty, our culture that loves liberty, we would think the enemy's at the gates. We need to defend ourselves. Everyone sign up for the military, defend the fatherland. And not only that, but, governments being governments, they will propagandize. And so when you come in and kill even these soldiers who signed up for it, they don't know that they're working for quote unquote a murderous dictator. Like, why would they join the government military if they did? Like, we're killing people who don't have stakes in this giant geopolitical game. And so this is aggression on a large level.
Yeah. I think the main point there is both, your cousin in the Marines and these Iraqi goat herders are signing up for the military. But the difference is the Iraqi goat herders don't have to go halfway around the world to shoot someone.
Yeah. I think that is something that it's, I know everyone uses that phrase. We got to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them over here.
But no, we're fighting them over. They don't like us because we're over there.
That's exactly right. Scott Horton loves to point out that before our adventures in the Middle East, we were beloved in the Middle East. The United States was beloved in the Middle East because back then it was the British and other European nations who were meddling.
It's almost like they just don't like the people that are screwing up their countries.
Yeah. And so they invited us in to deal with some of their problems. And in a short time of just basically taking over the job of the new meddlers, we became the the aim of the ire of the Middle East, because we became the new emperors. And no one likes being ruled by an emperor. It doesn't make sense. You need to look back no further than the American Revolution. As soon as we stopped considering ourselves British, we hated being ruled by Brits. And so, what do? We lock and load. We kick them out. No one wants to be ruled by some foreigner. It's no different in the Middle East. The reason they're chanting death to U.S. In fact, everyone's sharing that video of them saying death to U.S. all across their parliament, being like, see, they hate us. But they haven't been sharing the follow-up statement from the prime minister or the Ayatollah or whatever, saying, when we say death to U.S., we mean death to Donald Trump, Mike Pompeo, and they named another guy. I don't remember who it was. But we mean death to the leaders. We are fine with you, ordinary people. And I think that was such an interesting, telling statement.
That's amazing. I would have thought you made that up or something.
No, I saw that on Twitter of someone, and it actually was like a video with subtitles translating him. And because that is what they mean.
Wow.
This is the thing is we in this country, and honestly, it's not just this country. We as people tend to identify so much with our government. We even will say here, because we have this.
Yeah, and I think that's at odds with liberty.
We are the government.
To identify yourself with the state is also at odds with your own individual liberty, your local community's liberty, your individual state's liberty, your individual region, and your culture's liberty. So, we're the flyover libertarian. And so
that's right.
We're trying to point out that there's a cultural difference between the people in the flyover states and in the coasts.
Yeah.
And to identify yourself with this national, you're at odds with your own liberty and the liberty of the people you actually identify with.
Right. And that is why, another big reason why libertarians would consider ourselves so anti-war. If you go to antiwar.com, you'll notice that it's run by the Randolph Bourne Society. And you should go to antiwar.com. Really, you should. It's a great website. But it's run by the Randolph Bourne Society. And that's named after a man named Randolph Bourne. And he has this amazing quote where he says, war is the health of the state.
Yeah.
And to understand what he means by that is he separates society into three segments. There is the nation, the state, also society. A difference between our state, that is the rulers over our country, and the nation. America as a nation, if you go to my Twitter at flyoverliberta1, my pinned tweet is one of my favorite things I've ever said, and I love my own words, let me tell you. I said, I love America. People always accuse me of hating America. I love America. There's nowhere else I'd rather live. And there's nothing wrong with America that abolishing the United States wouldn't fix. There's a difference between America, the nation, and the United States government. And we conflate those two, and especially in times of war.
Yeah, war has this centralizing effect, both economically. You can just look at the U.S. in the late 1800s and then look at the U.S. after the Second World War. It's a completely different cultural identity, a completely different economy, a completely different set of laws, a completely different constitution, even worse. Yeah. And so war just has this centralizing effect that is extremely harmful to liberty, even if you just ignore the fact that people are dying and resources are being wasted in a way that the market wouldn't have otherwise spent them. And that's what's so frustrating about conservatives advocating war, is a conservative would never want to a conservative would never want to delegate any power that the state or the local community has and give that to the federal government. Mm-hmm. But all of a sudden, for no reason at all, their Department of Defense is literally the largest employer on the face of the earth. And for no reason, conservatives just blindly support whatever the DoD does.
Yeah. And this is it's interesting because this has been a change in the right in America really, I would say since the Cold War. The Cold War is really when what we call the neocons rose to power within the conservative movement. If you look at, and this is where it's fascinating also, where people are accusing me of being a leftist for opposing war. If you look at the old right, people like Albert J. Nock, H.L. Mencken, Russell Kirk, people like this, who Edmund Burke, who would be considered the conservatives who founded conservatism, they were staunchly anti-war. They were against the New Deal, and they were against the war, and they were against both for the same reasons, because they centralized the bureaucratic state, and because it has a destructive influence on culture. When fathers are dying in war, they cannot raise their children. Like, that is just obvious on the face of it. A conservative should want strong families. And we see these videos online, and sometimes we'll say these things among libertarian circles. We see these videos of daddy coming home from war, and we're like, oh, it's so beautiful. But I just feel the tragedy of it. That kid's been without his father for a year. And even like the issue of immigration, which I know the right is really concerned with. Why are we seeing mass migration out of the Middle East into the Western countries? It's because they're running away from their war-torn homes. Because we are sending their home nations into chaos, and we ourselves are causing chaos in their home nations. And so they're fleeing for a better life. And I really just want to invite Trump listeners, Trump fans, to think about what were the sort of things that Trump said during the campaign that drew people to him. Like, things that he said were things like, we're going to get control of our borders. Well, this isn't doing that. War isn't doing that. War is going to give more incentive for people to come here, because they're just fleeing the chaos and the war. But one of the other big things that he would always say, and he got tons of cheers for this, and this is one of the most hopeful things that I had out of the Trump election, was he would say things like, we need to stop these destabilizing regime change wars. What do you think the Iran war is going to be? This is another regime change war. If the neocons get their way and they're able to bully and cajole Trump into a war in Iran, because I do think that his instincts on war are still in the direction of peace. He's said things in the past that make me believe that. I think he's just not, he doesn't have the backbone and courage to stand by his convictions. He gets these experts in the room, and so-called experts in the room, and they tell him, no, we need to drop a bomb on Syria to respond. And he just sort of listens to them. If he goes into this, if they push him into this, it's going to be to take down their leadership, and it will send the nation into chaos.
I gotta wrap this up, because unlike you, I'm not in my parents' garage. I got a job to get to.
And I'm going on vacation, y'all.
We'll just call you Pastor Benny Hinn then, flying in your jet down to Florida.
That's right, flying on my jet. So once again, this is our second podcast, and we mentioned it on our first podcast. But we are going forward going to want to be doing, normally this time we'll end with a top fan comment segment and a hashtag meanwhile on Twitter segment. If you see craziness, tag one of us at FlyoverLiberta1 or at FlyoverLiberta2 with the hashtag meanwhile on Twitter, and we will feature that on future podcasts.
Well, this has been another episode of The Flyover Libertarian. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play, and join our email list at www.flyover.page. Thanks.